There's a version of you that shows up at work, a different version that shows up with old friends, another one entirely that comes out with family. You probably switch between them so smoothly you've never really stopped to notice you're doing it at all. Over 100 years ago, a psychiatrist gave this thing a name and argued that most people never realize how much it's actually running their life. He called it the persona. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what it is, why you built it without choosing to, and what happens to the parts of you it leaves out, where this idea comes from. This concept comes from Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist who worked closely with Sigmund Freud before developing his own distinct branch of psychology. Now called analytical psychology, Jung is also the reason words like introvert and extrovert exist in everyday language at all. He coined them. One of Jung's central ideas was the archetype, a recurring pattern of personality or behavior that shows up across cultures and individuals. Not because people copy each other, but because Jung believed these patterns are built into the shared structure of the human mind. The persona is one of the most immediately recognizable of these archetypes, and arguably the one operating in your life the most, every single day. It's worth being upfront about something before we go further. Jung's framework comes from psychoanalytic theory, not controlled experiments. It's influential and widely taught, but it isn't tested and replicated the way a neuroscience study is. Think of it less as a proven mechanism and more as a remarkably useful lens for understanding patterns in your own behavior. What the persona actually is. The word persona comes directly from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. Jung used it deliberately. The persona, in his framework, is the mask you present to the world. Not a lie, exactly, but a curated, socially adapted version of yourself, shaped by what your environment seems to expect and reward. This isn't inherently a bad thing. Jung saw the persona as necessary, a kind of social interface that lets you function across different settings without exposing every internal thought or feeling to everyone you encounter. The version of you that's measured and professional in a meeting, and the version that's relaxed and unfiltered with your closest friend, aren't both fake, they're both real adaptations, suited to real, different contexts. The trouble Jung pointed to isn't having a persona. It's what happens when someone starts to believe the persona is the entirety of who they are. When the mask becomes the problem, Jung warned specifically about a state where a person over-identifies with their persona. When the professional mask, the agreeable mask, the put-together mask becomes so consistently worn that the person genuinely forgets there's anything underneath it. This tends to show up as a particular kind of quiet exhaustion, the sense of performing even when no audience is watching, or a vague but persistent feeling of not knowing who you are outside of your role. The job title? The responsible one, the always fine one. Jung argued that whatever gets excluded from the persona doesn't simply vanish. It gets pushed into what he called the shadow, a separate archetype representing the parts of yourself you've disowned or suppressed because they didn't fit the mask you settled into. This is part of why people sometimes describe feeling unexpectedly emotional, irritable, or even unlike themselves during quiet, unstructured time. A vacation, a long weekend, a period without the usual role to perform. The mask gets to rest, and whatever it was holding back gets a little more room to surface. Why this still matters a century later, you don't need to accept every part of Jung's broader theory to find this particular idea useful, because the underlying observation holds up well. Even outside his original framework, humans do adapt different presentations of themselves to different contexts. And there is a real felt cost to losing touch with whatever exists underneath those adaptations. Modern psychology, working in a more empirical tradition, studies related territory under different names, self-concept clarity, authenticity, and identity integration. Across that more contemporary research, a consistent finding emerges: people who report feeling a closer match between their public self and their private self tend to report higher overall well-being than people who experience a large, persistent gap between the two. Jung's century-old language and modern psychology's more measured, data-driven language are pointing from very different methods at a similar underlying truth. The mask is useful. Losing track of what's underneath it isn't. A simple way to check in Jung's own suggestion wasn't to abandon the persona. He was clear that doing so isn't realistic or even desirable. It was to maintain enough awareness that you don't mistake the mask for the whole of who you are. A simple version of this, in practice, is occasionally asking which parts of how I'm showing up right now are genuinely me, and which parts are purely what this situation seems to expect. not as a test to pass, but as a small act of staying in contact with what's underneath the role. You're not trying to eliminate the professional version, the polished version, the agreeable version of yourself. You're just making sure you still recognize the rest of you when the mask comes off, the version of you at work, the version with old friends, the version with family. None of them are fake. But Jung's century-old observation still holds. It's worth occasionally checking that you know which parts are the mask and which parts are still underneath. Next time, we're exploring self-awareness and why it's harder to develop than most people assume. See you in the next one.